In September 1963, on a racetrack an hour outside Bologna, a car with no famous name, no factory backing, and no right to be there, crossed the finish line ahead of Ferrari. 3 men had built it by hand. 1 borrowed workshop. 18 months from blank paper to national champion. It should have been the start of a new era in Italian motorsport. Instead, what Enzo did next was never reported in the official histories, and it ended everything before it had a chance to begin. Drop a comment if you think the underdog deserved to survive. It is 1962. You are standing outside a modest workshop on the Via Ferrarese in Bologna, Italy. The city smells of motor oil and ambition. Through the window, 3 men are hunched over a drafting table, not in a gleaming factory, not in a corporate design studio with a marble reception and a secretary who screens your calls. In a garage, with their own hands, with their own money, with a single idea so specific and so combustible, it was practically a provocation. Their names were Giovanni Volpi, Giorgio Billi, and Berto Massimino. They had each spent years working inside the Italian automotive world, and that experience had taught them something most outsiders never learn. Success in this industry was never purely mechanical. It ran on relationships. It ran on who got invited to which dinners, whose calls got returned, whose name appeared in the right trade papers at the right time. They understood who got the contracts, who got the press, and who got quietly told that there was no room for a new name at the top of the table, and they had decided, in the particular way that only people who have nothing left to lose can decide, that they were going to build a car that would make Ferrari irrelevant. The company they founded was called ATS, Automobili Turismo e Sport. The name itself was a statement of intent, not a niche, not a footnote, not a regional curiosity. A full manufacturer, touring cars and sports cars, built to compete at the highest level of the Italian market, which in 1962 meant one thing and one thing only: you had to beat Maranello. This was not a small ambition for 3 men with a single rented space and a fraction of Ferrari's resources. Ferrari, by 1962, was not just a car company, but it was an institution. It had factory backing, decades of racing pedigree, relationships with every major supplier in the country, and a press corps that had spent years building Enzo Ferrari into something closer to a mythological figure than a businessman. To declare, from a garage, that you intended to make that institution irrelevant was not ambition. It was closer to a declaration of war. But ATS had something Ferrari, for all its history, did not have in 1962, a willingness to break with convention. While Ferrari's road cars continued to follow the traditional layout, engine at the front, driving the rear wheels through a long drive shaft, the ATS team began drawing up something different. A mid-engined layout, the kind of architecture that racing engineers understood, improved weight distribution and handling at the limit, but that no major manufacturer had yet brought confidently into a road-going Grand Tourer. The car they drew up was the ATS 2500 GT, a 2.5-litre V8 mounted behind the driver. Italian coachwork stretched over a purpose-built chassis, 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds. Numbers that would have been competitive against anything Ferrari was building at the time, road car or otherwise. There was no marketing department behind this decision. There was no boardroom debate, no committee weighing risk against tradition. There were 3 men who had run the numbers, trusted the engineering, and decided that the only way to beat the establishment was to refuse to build what the establishment expected. Financing came together slowly and unevenly, the way it tends to for companies with no factory and no track record. Some of it came from personal savings. Some came from investors willing to gamble on a name nobody had heard of, betting that engineering talent alone might be enough to carve out space in a market that had never made room for outsiders. It wasn't much. It was enough. By the end of 1962, the drawings had become a prototype. The prototype had become a running chassis. And the running chassis, against every reasonable expectation for a company that had existed for less than a year, had become a car that Volpi, Billi, and Massimino genuinely believed could compete. not just survive, but win against the most dominant manufacturer in Italian motorsport. On paper, it was Ferrari's equal. In practice, something far more dangerous was taking shape in that Bologna workshop, a car that might actually be Ferrari's better. To understand what ATS actually built, you have to understand what it meant to build a mid-engined V8 GT car in 1962. This was not standard practice. Ferrari was still putting engines at the front of its road cars. The engineering logic of relocating mass to the center of the chassis, improving balance, improving handling, transforming the car's behavior at the limit, was understood in racing circles, but it had not yet crossed into the road car world with any conviction. ATS crossed it anyway, without hesitation, without a roadmap, with 3 engineers, and a deadline that should have been impossible. 230 horsepower came out of a 2.5-liter V8 that the team designed from a blank sheet of paper. No borrowed architecture, no licensed engine, nothing inherited from a parent company, because there was no parent company. The chassis was purpose-built to support that mid-engine layout, and the body, penned by the coach builder Alemanno, turned out to be one of the most beautiful objects on 4 wheels produced in that entire decade. Long, low, aggressive in the way that only Italian coachwork from that era could be aggressive. Not threatening, inevitable. Quick question for you watching this. If you'd had money to put on any underdog beating Ferrari in 1963, would you have bet on 3 guys out of a rented Bologna garage? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see who actually called it. In 1963, the ATS 2500 GT entered the Italian Grand Touring Championship. It won. Let that sit for a moment. A company that had existed for less than 2 years, founded by 3 men with no factory and no racing pedigree, built a car from nothing and drove it to a national championship against Ferrari, on Ferrari's home soil, in front of the same press and the same officials who had spent decades treating Maranello as untouchable. That result should have been the beginning of something extraordinary. It should have opened doors, new investors, new factory space, new contracts, the kind of momentum that turns a scrappy startup into a real manufacturer. Instead, it triggered the opposite. Ferrari's response to the ATS victory was not congratulatory. It was surgical. Within months of the championship win, the Italian automotive establishment, the network of press relationships, supplier agreements, race series politics, and industry influence that Ferrari had spent 30 years constructing, began to tighten around ATS like a vice. Race entries became complicated, buried under administrative delays that never seemed to affect anyone else's paperwork. Supplier relationships became difficult, with components that had once arrived on schedule suddenly facing unexplained shortages. The press coverage that should have followed a championship win from a brand new Italian manufacturer arrived late, underreported, and framed in ways that subtly undermined the achievement. A footnote instead of a headline. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented industry history. Enzo Ferrari was not simply a car builder. He was the most politically connected figure in Italian motorsport, and he exercised that connection with the cold precision of a man who understood that dominance is never just mechanical. It is built and protected through relationships, through favors owed and called in, through the quiet machinery of an industry that polices its own hierarchy far more effectively than any rulebook ever could. By 1964, the money had run out. The company folded before it could build its second generation of cars. The original 2500 GT, which had beaten Ferrari, which had proven that a handful of engineers in a garage could out-engineer the most famous racing brand in the world, simply stopped. Production figures are disputed, but the most credible estimates place total road car output somewhere between 12 and 20 examples, 12 to 20 cars. That is the entire surviving legacy of a national championship. Today, when one of those cars surfaces at auction, it sells for between 800,000 and €1.5 million, not because of nostalgia, but because it is physical proof of something the official history of Italian automotive culture has spent 60 years quietly trying to minimize. For one brief, incandescent moment, Ferrari was beaten, fairly, completely, by people nobody had heard of. And now, before we get into what this story actually means, because there is a deeper layer here that I want you to understand, if this video is earning your time, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you think ATS was deliberately buried, or did they simply run out of road? I want to know what you think. Now, back to the story. The ATS 2500 GT is not a car story. It was never a car story. It is a story about what happens when the people who control an industry encounter genuine competition. Not marginal competition, not a challenger who is almost as good and can be absorbed or acquired or diplomatically neutralized, but genuine, demonstrable, championship-winning superiority from outside the established order. And the answer, in Italian motorsport in 1963, and in nearly every other industry you care to examine, is that the system protects itself. Not through sabotage necessarily, not through anything that looks sinister from a distance. Through the thousand small decisions made by the thousand small players who benefit from the existing hierarchy, the suppliers who quietly prioritize established customers, the journalists who frame newcomers as interesting but not serious, the race organizers who find administrative reasons to complicate entries from unfamiliar names. None of these decisions, taken individually, looks like an attack. A supplier prioritizing a long-standing customer over a new account is just business. A journalist giving more column space to an established legend than an unproven upstart is just editorial judgment. A race organizer, following procedure a little more strictly for an unfamiliar entrant, is just bureaucracy. But when those thousand small decisions all point in the same direction, made by people who all have something to gain from preserving the existing order, the cumulative effect is indistinguishable from a coordinated campaign, even if no single person ever sat down and planned it that way. This is the part of the story that the engineers at ATS never fully grasped until it was too late. They had beaten Ferrari on the road. They had not understood that the road was the easy part. Building a faster car turned out to be the achievable problem. It was a question of engineering, of talent, of the willingness to take risks that a more established, more conservative company would never take. 3 men with a drafting table and a borrowed garage could solve that problem in 18 months, and they did. Surviving the response to that victory was a different problem entirely, one that had nothing to do with horsepower or chassis design, and everything to do with relationships, capital reserves, and institutional patience. And it was a problem that ATS, by the nature of what it was, had no way to solve. A company with no factory, no long-term investors, and no political capital had no buffer to absorb a year of quietly sabotaged supply chains and underreported press coverage. Ferrari, with 30 years of accumulated relationships and resources, could simply wait them out. Here is the sentence I want you to carry out of this video. Excellence is not sufficient. Excellence is the price of entry. What actually wins, in the long run, is not the best product. It is the best product, combined with the institutional patience to survive long enough for the establishment to run out of ways to resist it. The ATS 2500 GT was excellent. It was not patient, because it had no way to be. It burned brilliantly for 2 years, and then it was gone, and Ferrari was still there, exactly where it had always been, as though the entire episode had never happened. This pattern is not unique to 1960s Italian motorsport. Look at almost any industry with an established hierarchy, and you will find some version of this same story, a genuine innovation, a moment where the outsider proves itself superior on merit alone, followed by a slow, diffuse, often invisible institutional response that has nothing to do with the quality of the work and everything to do with protecting the existing order. The names change, the mechanism does not. That is not a car lesson. That is a lesson about every room you will ever try to enter, every industry where the people already inside have spent years building the very same kind of quiet institutional advantage that buried ATS. Talent gets you through the door once. It does not guarantee you get to stay. E-story. The surviving ATS 2500 GTs are scattered across private collections in Europe, rarely seen, rarely discussed, almost never given the credit they earned. If you know someone who believes that the best product always wins, share this with them. They need to see this. They need to see this.